Every corner of the world has seen war, even Switzerland. War has raged across every continent for thousands of years. But what were the bloodiest battles on each continent? Well, that's what I'm here to answer. Kind of. Starting from the least bloodiest battle to the most. Keep in mind that it is sometimes hard to find out exactly what the bloodiest battles in some continents are, and not all sources show the same casualty counts, as you can see with this page that claims that the Battle of Yorktown is the bloodiest battle of all time. In case you don't know, the battle only suffered around 1,293 casualties, but it was probably even lower than that. So it is honestly kind of impossible to tell exactly. Therefore, it is very possible that I get some of these wrong. One final thing, if you don't know what the word casualty means, then it basically means a soldier who is killed or wounded. Rather unsurprisingly, Antarctica has never seen any wars or battles, so that whole thing about every corner of the world seeing war isn't entirely true. Now, actually starting off, we have the Battle of Casualty. If you've never heard of this battle, then I wouldn't blame you. I didn't hear of this until I did research for this video. It was a battle during the Paraguayan War, better known as the War of the Triple Alliance. The war was fought from 1864 to 1870 between Paraguay and the Triple Alliance, which consisted of Argentina, the Empire of Brazil, and Uruguay. It was the bloodiest interstate war ever fought in South America, which is quite the coincidence that the bloodiest war fought in South America began towards the end of the bloodiest war fought in North America. Paraguayan forces learned that Allied forces were planning to attack them on May 25th, so they attacked the Allied encampment of Casualty on the 24th. The Paraguayans attacked the Allies in three groups. General Vicente Barrios attacked the left. I have no idea how to say the Spanish names, by the way. General Isidoro Risquin on the right, and Colonel Jose Diaz through the center. The battle began with an attack on the center, forcing back Allied forces. On the left, Allied Lieutenant Colonel Emilio Millet ordered a large moat built in front of his artillery. When Paraguayan forces attacked the artillery, they were unable to cross the moat and were cut up by grape shot. They tried to flank the artillery, but met Antonio Sampaio's 3rd Infantry Division, and were repelled after a brutal fight in the mud. Around this point, Allied reserves attacked and repelled the Paraguayan center. On the right, Paraguayan forces forced back a few Allied units and almost reached the Allied camp. But Brazilian General Orcio quickly reinforced their lines with several units, including the 2nd Cavalry Division. Eventually, the battle turned into a series of charges and countercharges, described by the Wikipedia as a Latin America version of Waterloo. Despite the constant attacks, Paraguayan forces were forced to retreat. The aftermath of the battle was described by Paraguayan soldier Colonel Thompson. At 4 p.m. the firing was over, the Paraguayans being completely defeated and their army destroyed. The Allies had suffered severely also, but still had an army left. The Paraguayans left 6,000 dead on the field. The Allies only took some 350 prisoners, all wounded. This was because Paraguayans would never surrender, but when wounded, fought on till they were killed. 7,000 wounded were taken into Paraguayan hospitals from this battle, those with slight wounds not going into the hospital at all. The Allies lost above 8,000 killed and wounded. Within one day, Paraguay suffered 6,000 dead and 7,000 wounded, while the Alliance suffered 996 dead and 3,232 wounded. A grand total of 17,228,000 casualties. Next, we reach Africa and the Second World War. That didn't take long. The bloodiest battle here is the Second Battle of El Alamein, which was fought in Egypt from October 23rd to November 11th, 1942. By October of 1942, Axis forces had pushed Allied forces almost back to Alexandria, with their goal to take the Suez Canal. However, Allied forces stopped at El Alamein and planned to attack. El Alamein was in a different location than others, as it is situated between the sea and the Quattara Depression, which is basically a sea of quicksand that makes heavy mechanized vehicles, such as tanks, which were very important in the North African campaign, unable to pass through it. Because of these two factors, neither side was able to flank the other, which forced a head-on battle. Now at this point, Axis forces were running low on supplies, in particular, fuel, which prevented them from fighting a fast and mobile fight, which is almost essential in the vast deserts of North Africa. Because of this, Rommel, who was the German commander in Africa, set up strong defensive positions behind thick minefields, nicknamed the Devil's Garden. Meanwhile, British Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery decided to wait to build up his forces and train his troops, despite the urges from Winston Churchill to attack early. Montgomery's plan was to launch a main attack in the north and a secondary attack in the south. Now a lot happened during this battle, so I'm going to skip past a lot of history. So if you want to learn more details, then I recommend you do your own research. And there is a lot of it. Trust me, just look at the Wikipedia page. This same thing will be true for all upcoming battles that last longer than a few days. So just keep that in mind as I go through these. On the night of October 23rd, Operation Lightfoot began, with an Allied artillery barrage. The next day, British engineers began to clear 2 channels through the minefields, in order to allow armored forces through. On the morning of October 24th, Axis forces were shocked by the attack, resulting in a bit of a disaster for the German headquarters in terms of communication, with one Italian unit claiming that they had been wiped out by, and I quote, drunken, I don't really want to say that word, with tanks. Operation Crumbling began shortly after. Allied forces formed a forward line with the purpose of wearing down Axis forces. However, Allied efforts to push back Axis forces were hampered because their tanks were slowed down making their way through the minefield. Soon after the 26th, Axis forces counterattacked, and even though they gained some success, it was not enough. On November 1st, Operation Supercharge began. Montgomery launched a diversionary attack to draw Axis reserves, before launching his main attack. After days of brutal fighting, the Allies broke through enemy lines on the 4th. This breakthrough resulted in many Axis prisoners, and forced Rommel to retreat, allowing Montgomery to push Axis forces into Libya, and eventually into Tunisia, forcing the Axis out of Africa. The battle caused 13,560 Allied casualties, and 6,985 Axis casualties, a total of 20,545,000 casualties. Now Oceania is a bit more difficult, because we have 2 possible choices here. Those choices are Bunagona and Guadalcanal. One is much better known than the other. The reason that I debated this is because I don't consider military campaigns as battles. They are a collection of battles. But since the island of Guadalcanal isn't too big, and it lasted only 6 months, I'm going to talk about Guadalcanal here. But let's give an honorable mention to the Battle of Bunagona, fought in New Guinea by US and Australian forces versus the Japanese Empire from November 16th, 1942 to January 22nd, 1943. The battle caused 22,491 total casualties. And now moving to the Guadalcanal. The battle raged from August 7th, 1942 to February 9th, 1943, and was fought between the United States, Australia, the Kingdom of Togo, which is basically a small island in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, New Zealand, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands, against the Japanese Empire. The night of August 6, 1942 in the Solomon Islands experienced bad weather, allowing Allied forces to land on the island unseen by the Japanese defenders. On the following morning, they took them by surprise, securing the beachhead. The nearby small islands were also taken within the following days. On August 8th, US Marines took the nearby airfield with little resistance, only suffering 13 dead. Japanese forces counterattacked at Tanaru on August 21st, which failed completely, and only about 30 out of the 917 survived, including the 15 that were captured. Throughout this entire battle, there were naval and aerial battles around Guadalcanal, but I'm going to skip over these. On September 7th, the Japanese once again planned an attack with the objective of taking the airfield, now known by Allied forces as Henderson Field. However, a day later on September 8th, US Marines led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson raided the main Japanese supply depot, destroying many supplies such as food and ammunition. They also found some documents, which told of the Japanese plans on attacking Henderson Field. Edson and other officers correctly predicted that the Japanese would attack from a ridge called Lunga Ridge. From the 12th to the 14th, Japanese forces were halted on the ridge before they could even begin their assault on Henderson Field. The ridge would gain the name Edson's Ridge by the soldiers because his men fought viciously on the ridge. Following the victory at Edson Ridge, US Marines attempted to push back the Japanese from September 23rd to the 27th, but these attempts would end in failure, with 3 Marine companies being surrounded and almost destroyed. They tried again from October 6th to October 9th, and successfully crossed the Matanika River. On the evening of October 23rd, Japanese forces launched yet another attack on Henderson Field. However, these were again repulsed by the 26th of October. By the end, the Japanese had suffered 3,000 casualties, while the US Marines suffered only 80. Casualty rates are similar for most fights during the battle in the entire Pacific War. In order to take advantage of the victory at Henderson Field, US forces launched an attack to the west of Matanika on November 1st. On the 8th, they began to encircle Japanese forces, and by the 12th, every Japanese soldier encircled had been killed, suffering between 450 to 475 dead, while the US lost 40 dead and 120 wounded. And in case you're wondering why Japanese forces are being slaughtered almost to a man in most fights, then you should know that it's not because Allied forces were brutal savages who took no prisoners. It's because Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered, and often fought to the death instead of retreat. On December 12th, Japanese officers began to plan a secret withdrawal from Guadalcanal. The plans were set to begin in January, but before the withdrawals could occur, Allied, mainly US, forces attacked Mount Austin on December 18th. However, this attack was halted on January 4th, 1943. On the 10th, they resumed the attack on Mount Austin, and began new attacks on the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse ridges. And again, the Japanese forces suffered far heavier casualties, 3,000 versus 250 Allied casualties. The evacuation began on January 14th, and ended on February 9th. At the start of the battle, the Japanese had 36,200 soldiers. By the end, they suffered 19,200 casualties, while the Allies had 7,000 dead and 7,789 wounded, a total of 34,089 casualties. But let's be real here. Obviously, the bloodiest battle fought in Oceania was the vicious Battle of Campion during the Great Emu War, fought on November 2nd, 1932, between Australia and the Great Emu Army. Here we are, the final three, and in third place we got North America. If you're American and know more about the Civil War than the fact that it was a civil war, which is a sadly low number of people, then you'll know of the Battle of Gettysburg. One of, if not the most important battle of the American Civil War. Up until the battle, the Confederacy had been winning in the Eastern Theater, not so much on the Western Theater. But following this battle, Confederates were on the run, and when the absolute Chad, Ulysses S. Grant, was put in charge of the Union Army in the East, it was game over for them. But now back to the battle. Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry, who were effectively the eyes and ears of General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, had gone missing for around a week, leaving the Confederate Army blind. Because of this, when Confederate forces engaged Union cavalry near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on July 1st, 1863, Lee had no idea if he just encountered a little cavalry regiment or the vanguard of the Army of the Potomac, which was the U.S. Army in the Eastern Theater. Brigadier General Buford's Union cavalry had quickly gained the high ground around Gettysburg and held off Confederate forces until reinforcements could arrive. The first Union regiments to arrive was Major General John F. Reynolds' division. Reynolds was then shot and killed only 20 minutes after arriving. Soon after, Confederate forces arrived and pushed Union forces back into the town of Gettysburg and forced them to fortify the land south of the town. With this initial Confederate victory, the first day ended. I skipped over a lot of the first day and it often gets overlooked, but the first day was still extremely bloody. Over the night from July 1st to the 2nd, the Union and Confederate armies in bulk arrived at Gettysburg. The Union forces held a strong defensive position shaped like a fishhook, forcing the Confederates to attack them. They attacked on the Union left flank on July 2nd. It is here that some of the bloodiest fighting in the battle occurs. Union Major General Sickles is an idiot and moves his division forward from the fishhook and occupies the peach orchard, which he thought was higher ground. It wasn't. Unsurprisingly, he got pushed back by Confederate forces and almost lost the Union the battle since Confederate forces could have broken through the line there. Also because of Sickles, fighting raged in the bloody wheat field, referred to as a whirlwind of death. You may have heard the quote, "You could walk across the field without your feet touching the ground." There are a few of these quotes throughout the war, but one of them is from the wheat field at Gettysburg. Further left of that, we have Little Round Top and Devil's Den. Devil's Den, which is a collection of large boulders, was taken by Confederate forces, allowing them to fire on Union soldiers up on Little Round Top. Colonel Strong Vincent notices that the Union force on Little Round Top is lacking troops, and moves his 4 regiments to the hill without waiting for orders. Soon after, Confederate forces charged up the hill several times. The 20th Maine held the end of the defensive line. If they fell, so would the hill, allowing the Confederacy to win the battle. Realizing they're out of ammo, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered his men to bayonet charge down the hill towards the advancing Confederates, driving them back, and securing Little Round Top for the rest of the battle. On the right flank, Confederate Lieutenant General Richard Ewell attacks Culp's Hill. Many of the original Union defenders on the hill were moved to defend the left flank, leaving Culp's Hill with less defenders. Despite this, they held Culp's Hill, although giving up some of the lower earthwork. The Union had won the second day. and to several Confederate officers it was clear that they would not win the battle. But Lee was determined that they could win the battle, so as July 2nd dawned, Lee would make possibly the greatest mistake that he would ever make. The Union had suffered heavy casualties on their flanks from the previous day's fighting. Because of this, they moved men from the center to reinforce the flanks. This caused Lee to believe that the center was the weakest point in the Union line. In reality, it was the strongest. To reach the center, Confederate troops would have to cross 3/4 of a mile of open fields, while under intense Union artillery and rifle fire. This would become known as Pickett's Charge. Before Pickett's Charge, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, who was Lee's second in command, ordered an artillery barrage on the Union line, but Union artillery only returned fire, and this created the loudest man-made sound made on the North American continent until the detonation of the first atomic bomb, 82 years later. At 2 p.m., 2,500 Confederate soldiers began the charge. By the way, it wasn't really a charge, at least not at first. Confederate forces walked in lines through the field. It should probably be called Pickett's Walk. But anyway, I probably don't even have to tell you how this charge went, but I will anyway. Union forces held their fire, drawing Confederates into a kill zone, and when they reached it, the Union troops held nothing back. Union artillery opened fire on the advancing rebels, causing horrendous casualties. As they got into closer range, the artillery began using canister shells, which basically makes the cannon a large shotgun, and the Union soldiers began volley fire. However, despite all this, the Confederates reached the Union line, and brutal hand-to-hand combat began. By the end, however, Confederate forces retreated, with only half of those who first crossed the field. There were also 2 bloody cavalry engagements out near Culp's Hill on the 3rd day, but it kind of pales in comparison to Pickett's Charge. By the end of the day, it was clear that the Union had won the battle. Lee gathered his army and led them back into Virginia, shouting to his troops along the way that it was all his fault. The casualties of this brutal 3-day battle was 23,049 Union and 28,000 Confederate casualties, a total of 51,000 casualties. This battle remained the bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States until the Battle of the Bulge, 81 years later. Now there is going to be quite a jump in the death count, and when I say quite, I mean huge. In second place, we've got Asia. And this battle is going to be very different from the other battles, for this one doesn't involve gunpowder in any form, but instead blades and arrows. The siege of Baghdad lasted from January 29th to February 10th, 1258, a mere 13 days, occurring towards the end of the Mongols' bloody expansion across Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. Over nearly 10 years, Monk Khan had expanded the empire throughout the Middle East, but the most important city in the Middle East was Baghdad. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which is basically one of the primary powers in the Middle East at the time. The Abbasids gathered 70,000 men to defend the city, but they were quickly gathered and lacked equipment and discipline. When the Mongols arrived with around 93,000 men, they, in classic Mongol fashion, demanded that the city surrender. When they refused, the Mongols besieged the city. On January 29th, 13 days later, the city surrendered. The Mongols then began a week-long destruction and slaughter. Most of the city was destroyed, including the epic Baghdad House of Wisdom, containing several precious documents, featuring just about every subject of history and science known of at the time, along with most of the city's population having been killed. Caliph al-Mustasim, the leader of the Abbasid Caliphate, was rolled up in a rug and then trampled to death by horses. The fall of Baghdad ended the Abbasid Caliphate, a major power in the Middle East and Africa for centuries. It became yet another nation destroyed by the Mongol Empire. Now let's hold up here for a second. Despite all I just said, this might not be the bloodiest battle in Asia. The casualty rate of the siege varies greatly since it occurred in medieval times. The Arab accounts from the time claimed there were 2 million casualties. Western accounts claim roughly 800,000 casualties, while some modern historians claim it to be much lower, somewhere around 90,000. So what's the real answer? Well, it's pretty much impossible to know for certain. In my opinion, I would say the Arab casualties were probably somewhere around 1 million. This is also backed up by the estimated population of Baghdad, which was around 1 to 2 million in the year 1200. But you also have to ask yourself how reliable this population count is. How did they gather it? Did they count every single person one by one? It also wouldn't surprise me if the Abbasid Caliphate exaggerated the population of its greatest city in order to make themselves look better to everybody else, especially Christian Europe. So with all that, I would say a death count is probably somewhere around 900,000 and 1.5 million casualties. But just in case the 90,000 death estimate is right, I'm going to give an honorable mention to the Battle of Changping, a bloody battle during the Warring States period in China, fought between the states of Zhao and Qin, resulting in around 700,000 casualties. Finally, first place. If you know your continents, then you'll know that the only one left is Europe. And the bloodiest battle here is the bloodiest battle ever fought in human history, the Battle of Stalingrad. The battle lasted from August 23rd, 1942 to February 2nd, 1943. It's been over a year since Germany invaded the Soviet Union. After the defeat at Moscow in January 1942, Hitler changed his plans. He would strike south into the Caucasus and take the oil located there. However, in order to do this, they needed to take the Soviet city of Stalingrad. 2 infantry and 2 panzer divisions were ordered to take Stalingrad, but Hitler redirected half of the army group to move south, while the other half, consisting of the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, would continue towards Stalingrad. The Soviets knew of the Germans' advance ahead of time, so they shipped grain, cattle, and railway cars across the Volga River. But Stalin refused to evacuate the 400,000 civilians in Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force in case you didn't know, sank most Soviet ships trying to cross the Volga, cutting off Soviet forces defending the city from their supplies. The battle began with the Luftwaffe bombing the city, dropping 1,000 tons of bombs on the city within 48 hours, more than the total dropped on Britain during the blitzes. This was followed by Axis forces assaulting the city. Stalin rushed any available troops to the Volga. With the Luftwaffe having destroyed the bridges over the city, Soviet troops were forced to ride in troop barges being towed by tugs, leaving them easy targets to the Luftwaffe. While all of this was happening, factories in Stalingrad were still making tanks, and civilians, including women and children, were building defenses such as trenches throughout the city. On August 23rd, a massive German aerial bombing caused a firestorm, which is basically a fire so big that it creates its own wind system. This firestorm killed roughly 955 people and left large amounts of the city a pile of burnt ruins. Until Soviet reinforcements arrived, the defense of the city fell to the 1077th Anti-Air Regiment, which was made up mostly of female soldiers who had no training or combat experience. Despite this, and with no support from other Soviet forces, they held their posts and took on advancing German tanks, fighting to the last. During the start of the battle, the NKVD organized soldiers to help in the defense. These civilians were often sent into battle without guns. Students and staff from a university formed a tank destroyer unit. They used tanks sent immediately from the factories, with many of them lacking gun sights, forcing the crews to aim through the inside of the gun barrels. By September, more Soviet forces arrived in the city, and on September 5th, they launched a massive offensive, but it was repelled with the help of the Luftwaffe. On September 14th, both German and Soviet forces launched attacks. The Soviet 13th Guards Rifle Division was a part of one of these attacks, with the objective to capture Railway Station No. 1. Within the first 34 hours, they suffered 30% casualties, and by the time the attack ended, just 320 out of the original 10,000 survived. The 13th Guards Rifle Division succeeded in taking the railway station, but not for long. The station changed hands 14 times in 6 hours, and by the end of the next day, the 13th Guards Rifle Division ceased to exist. In the south of the city, a Soviet platoon fortified a 4-story building overlooking the riverside. They surrounded it with minefields and set up machine gun positions. Keep in mind that platoons typically consist of 10 to 100 people, and they were able to hold the building for 2 months without significant reinforcements. The building became known as the Fortress to German forces. By September 27th, Axis forces captured the southern part of the city. The fighting in the city was brutal, as German and Soviet forces fought street to street and house to house, fighting to the last man, as both sides knew what awaited them if they surrendered, either execution or years of misery and torture in POW camps. Snipers on both sides thrived in the destroyed city, being able to easily hide in destroyed buildings and kill enemy officers and soldiers in the streets. The Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev became famous throughout the Soviet Union, with 225 confirmed kills during the battle. By November, after 3 months of house-to-house fighting, Axis forces finally reached the riverbank, capturing 90% of the city. By now, ice began to form on the Volga, preventing boats from crossing. On November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, and by November 23rd, the Axis forces in Stalingrad had been surrounded and cut off from food and ammunition. Despite German officers constantly requesting a breakout of Stalingrad, Hitler refused, leaving the Axis forces trapped there to their fate. The Germans attempted to break the encirclement and relieve Axis forces in Stalingrad during Operation Winter Storm. However, the attack ultimately failed on December 23rd. From December to February, Axis forces in Stalingrad fought on, starving, low on ammunition, and lacking good winter clothing, while enduring the brutal Russian winter. Many of them being forced to take clothing and weapons from dead Soviet and Axis soldiers. Finally, on February 2nd, 1943, the remaining Axis forces in Stalingrad surrendered, the Soviets having taken 91,000 Axis prisoners. Only 6,000 of them would survive the brutal Russian gulags. This battle changed the course of the war in the Eastern Front. From now on, Axis forces would be pushed more and more out of the Soviet Union. Casualties in Stalingrad were of course heavy. There were 400,000 civilians in the city at the start of the battle, and by the end, there were somewhere between 10,000 to 60,000 left. Around 40,000 civilians were captured and sent to Germany as slave laborers. Axis forces took around 868,374 casualties, while Soviet forces suffered roughly 1,129,619 casualties, resulting in a grand total of 1,997,993 casualties. After Stalin's death, Stalingrad would be renamed to Volgograd. Bodies are still being found in the city to this day. Well, I'm sure that brightened your day, especially since all but one of these battles happened within the last 150 years. 3 of which happening in living memory. Maybe I'll make a video about the worst massacre on each continent. Expect to see Europe and Asia at the top again, and World War II. Thanks, Germany and Japan.